Before I begin, let me ask you something. Would you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel? And please, tell me in the comments, what city are you listening from? I love knowing where these stories reach. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 67 years old. I was born and raised in Worthington, Ohio, a leafy suburb just north of Columbus. For 35 years, I served as a high school librarian, mending books, shushing chatter, and whispering encouragements to teenagers who didn't yet know that stories could save them. For nearly 4 decades, I was Harold's wife, and for 40 years, I have been Mike's mother. And for 2 years now, I have been a widow. I never imagined that title, widow, would sit so heavily on me. The day Harold collapsed, I lost not only my husband, but the rhythm of a shared life. Morning coffee poured into chipped mugs, crossword puzzles penciled on the porch, the way he whistled tunelessly while fixing squeaky hinges. The house we had raised Mike in felt cavernous, echoing with a silence that mocked me. In those first weeks after Harold's passing, I lived on autopilot, answering sympathy cards with polite scrawls, eating casseroles dropped off by well-meaning neighbors, and folding laundry just to keep my hands busy. Grief has a way of bending time. Days stretched into tunnels, hours folded in on themselves, and the smallest decisions, what to eat, whether to get dressed, felt insurmountable. Then came the envelope. It had sat for a week on the dining room table, heavy with its own authority, propped against the silver teacup Harold and I received on our wedding day. The insurance company's seal looked official and cold, but inside was a message that was anything but. Harold had named me the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy. The numbers on the page blurred, not from their size, but from what they meant. I saw what you carried. Have something that's yours. I sat for a long while, fingers pressed to the cool rim of that wedding cup, hearing Harold's voice as though he were across from me. Evelyn, don't vanish inside your giving. Build something for yourself. That night, after a supper I barely tasted, I called a young estate attorney a neighbor had once recommended, Lauren Jensen. She came to my home 2 days later, legal pad in hand, calm and precise. She explained what Harold's gift could mean if I chose to protect it wisely. Together we established a trust, the HPC Legacy Trust, that would allow me to purchase property quietly, without drawing family expectations or gossip from the community. I had no intention of buying just any property. I wanted a place that would breathe with me, a house that would not simply contain me but remind me who I was. And then I found it, a red brick Victorian on Sycamore Street. The first time I saw it, I felt as though the house exhaled into me. The wraparound porch with its weathered railings, the turret rising like a crown, the stained glass window catching afternoon sun in blues and ambers. Inside, original oak floors creaked underfoot, whispering of families long past. The parlor smelled faintly of dust and lilacs. In the kitchen, a porcelain farmhouse sink waited, scratched but dignified, beside tile squares in faded blue and white. I knew instantly, this was not just a house. It was a keeper of memory, waiting for someone to honor it. The purchase went through the trust. The papers were signed quietly, without fanfare. I walked out of the county office with the deed tucked under my arm, feeling like I had rescued not only a house, but myself. The renovations were not grand, but intentional. Brass fixtures were rewired rather than replaced. Harold always said shine was less important than function. Wallpaper in soft violets covered cracks with gentleness instead of erasure. I kept the creaky boards that groaned in the hallway. They felt like guardians. Each morning I arrived with thermos coffee and a small notebook, jotting down ideas for curtains, a rug, the library I would build in the turret. Neighbors began to notice, of course. One afternoon, Miriam, a 70-year-old woman with lipstick always a shade too bright and a cane decorated with stickers, knocked at the open door. She carried cranberry scones and a mischievous smile. "Bold move," she said, setting the basket on the half-sanded counter. "A woman your age buying a place like this. You planning to tame it or let it tame you?" I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in months. Maybe a bit of both. For a few weeks I lived in a bubble of quiet creation. I scraped paint, planted roses, and stood at twilight watching the stained glass cast jeweled light on bare walls. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt not hollow, but grounded. And then the phone rang. It was Mike. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone accustomed to asking without considering the weight of his request. He and Kara, his wife of 2 years, were house hunting for her parents. He described a Victorian on Sycamore Street. Yes, the very one I had just bought. He mentioned it was held by some trust, not a private seller, and wondered aloud if I might help them with the down payment. "Think of it as part of our future inheritance," he said lightly, as though I were a banker handing out advances. I agreed to think about it, but inside I already knew. They were asking me to help them purchase the very house I had claimed as my sanctuary. And if that were not bitter enough, the true blow had not yet fallen. When I hung up the phone with Mike, my hand lingered on the receiver a moment too long, as if holding it could anchor me in something steady. The request itself was audacious enough, but what unsettled me most was how casual he sounded, as if my life, my grief, and my choices were simply items on a family shopping list. That night I lay awake in the small bedroom I had claimed in the Victorian while renovations were underway. The moonlight streamed through the lace curtain I'd hastily pinned up, throwing shadows across the half-finished plaster. I listened to the creaks of the old house and felt both comforted and warned. Houses speak, if you let them. This one whispered, "Protect me." The following morning, I brewed tea and tried to put the conversation aside. There were curtains to hem, roses to water, and shelves to measure for the turret room that would become my library. But my mind kept circling back to Mike's words. Think of it as part of our inheritance. Inheritance. The very word carried weight in my family, and not always the good kind. Harold and I had worked our entire lives for the little we had. We paid off the mortgage slowly, one school paycheck and one sales commission at a time. We were not the Rockefellers. And yet here was my son, speaking of inheritance as though it were a credit line, ready to be drawn on at his convenience. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was a quiet sorrow. I raised him to value books over balance sheets, kindness over cleverness. Where had those values gone? 3 days later, I had my answer. I returned to the house on Sycamore in the late afternoon, carrying a sack of groceries and my tool bag. As I walked up the steps, I noticed the front door was ajar. My heart skipped. I pushed gently, and the hinges moaned. Voices floated through the hallway, light and confident. I set the groceries down silently and followed the sound. There, in the parlor, stood Kara, Mike's wife, her auburn hair swept into a glossy knot, a binder in one hand and a latte in the other. Beside her was her mother, a woman with sharp cheekbones and the same air of practiced certainty. "And this," Kara said brightly, sweeping her arm toward the staircase, "will be our guest entrance. We'll restore the banister, maybe in white oak. Mom, you'll love the light that comes in through the stained glass upstairs. It's practically your suite already." My breath caught. Your suite. I stayed hidden in the hallway, listening. Kara continued her tour with the confidence of a realtor, her heels clicking against the oak floors I had just oiled. She moved toward the kitchen, talking about gutting it for a modern island and turning the turret into a studio. The turret, my library. I felt a pulse of heat in my chest, not of rage, but of deep, territorial grief. Harold's photo sat on that windowsill upstairs, smiling toward the street as though he were welcoming me home each day. To think of that sacred corner stripped bare for yoga mats and scented candles was almost unbearable. Kara's mother nodded approvingly at everything, sipping her coffee, as if this red brick Victorian had already passed into their hands by some unspoken entitlement. I wanted to step forward, to shout, to demand what right they had to walk through my home as if I were invisible. But instead, I turned away. I climbed the back stairs quietly and slipped into the turret. I stood there in the fading light, tracing the colored glass patterns across the wall, letting their jeweled tones steady me. Harold's picture smiled up at me from the sill. I whispered, "Not today. Not like this." I left the house without being seen. I locked the back door carefully and walked down the side path toward the street. The evening air was cool against my skin, and the roses I had planted trembled in the breeze. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, but my heart was strangely calm. I knew in that moment that confrontation would not be my weapon. I had been a librarian too long to believe in shouting as a solution. No, my instrument would be silence, deliberate and sharp as a turned page. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, candle flickering low, and wrote a single sentence in my notebook. "They will not erase me." I underlined it twice. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt something stir inside me that was not grief but resolve. Still, one question haunted me as I blew out the candle and climbed the stairs to bed. If they were bold enough to give tours of a house that wasn't theirs, what else were they willing to do? When you have spent a lifetime surrounded by books, you learn something about silence. It is never empty. Silence can be reverent, defiant, or dangerous, depending on who wields it. I thought of this as I turned the corner onto Sycamore Street a week later. The house stood in late afternoon sunlight, its brick glowing like old embers. For the first time, I noticed another car parked in the driveway, a silver crossover with a familiar dent near the taillight, Kara's. My chest tightened. I pulled into the curb across the street and sat with the engine off. Through the front windows, I saw movement, shadows against the lace curtains I had so carefully pinned. Voices drifted out, muffled but distinct. I crossed the street slowly, my shoes crunching against gravel. The roses I planted at the base of the porch swayed as if they too were unsettled. When I reached the door, I didn't step inside right away. I pressed my hand against the warm wood, steadying myself, listening. "And the master suite will be perfect once we tear out those dated fixtures." Kara's voice rang out, breezy and confident. "Mom, you can have the guest room across the hall. The light is so flattering in the mornings." Her mother chuckled, the sound low and approving. I pushed the door open without a sound and stepped inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards betrayed me, but no one turned. They were too absorbed in their performance. From the bottom of the staircase, I could see Kara's binder open, pages marked with sticky notes. She was pointing up toward the landing, describing flow and potential. I climbed one step, then another, careful as a shadow. By the time I reached the turret room, my breath was shallow. I leaned against the frame, staring at the colored light pouring through the stained glass. Red, blue, amber, patches of sacred quiet across the wall. Harold's photograph smiled faintly from the sill, as though he too was watching the show downstairs. I didn't speak. I didn't announce myself. I simply stood in the room that was mine, letting the colors wash over me. Below, Kara continued, "This whole space could be a yoga studio, open, serene, perfect for energy flow. My library." I swallowed hard, but still I didn't move. Something shifted inside me then, subtle, but absolute. Anger would only fuel her certainty. A confrontation would give her drama to twist against me. But silence could hold a sharper edge. I turned, leaving the photograph where it was, and slipped down the back staircase, the one off the kitchen. My footsteps blended with the groan of the old house. When I reached the back door, I paused only long enough to glance once more at the hallway rug, rolled up against the wall, waiting for its place. Then I stepped out into the cooling air. The evening smelled of lilacs and damp earth. I pulled the door shut behind me with deliberate gentleness, turning the lock until it clicked. On the sidewalk, I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath for too long. My pulse throbbed in my temples, but my hands were steady. I walked past Kara's silver car, past the roses, past the neighbors' tidy lawns. Not a word had been spoken, but everything had been said. That night, at my small rental house where I still kept most of my belongings, I lit a cinnamon candle and opened my notebook. I wrote a single line. "Silence will be my instrument." I underlined it once, then twice, then closed the cover. The house on Sycamore was mine, not only in deed and trust, but in spirit. I had chosen it, restored it, breathed life into it. And now, without raising my voice, I would protect it. I thought of Miriam, my neighbor who carried cranberry scones and bold lipstick. She once told me that boundaries are like doors. You don't slam them, you simply lock them. That evening, as the candle burned low, I understood her perfectly. Tomorrow, I would change the locks. Tomorrow, I would draw the line no one could mistake. But as I drifted to sleep, a question nagged at the edges of my mind. What would Kara do when her keys no longer fit? The very next morning, I called Lauren Jensen, my attorney. Her voice was brisk but warm, as if she'd been expecting this call all along. "You're ready," she said simply. I didn't ask how she knew. Some truths carry their own echo. By noon, Lauren and I were walking through the Victorian with a locksmith trailing behind us. The man was older, with wiry hands that knew every weight of brass and steel. He carried a canvas bag filled with gleaming cylinders and spare keys. The sound of his tools was like a hymn to me, small metallic notes promising safety. "Change every lock," I told him. "Front, back, basement, even the attic." He nodded, not asking questions, just doing his work with quiet efficiency. Lauren walked with me through the rooms, clipboard in hand. "We'll also install cameras," she said. "Discreet ones. You'll get an alert every time someone tries a door." Her calm gave me courage. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving grief. I was taking a stand. By late afternoon, the locks were new, the cameras angled just so, and I held in my hand a ring of keys that belonged only to me. I slipped one into my pocket, heavy, with meaning. That night, I returned with a single candle and a note. In the kitchen, where the faint smell of varnish lingered, I placed the candle on the counter and lit it. The flame flickered against the violet wallpaper I had chosen, casting the room in soft gold. Beside it, I set down the folded note, written in my steady librarian script. "This house already has an owner, and she isn't invisible. No anger, no threat, just fact." I locked the door behind me and walked home beneath the weight of the stars. 2 days later, the cameras sang. I was brewing tea when my phone buzzed with an alert. "Front door activity." My heart steadied into a rhythm as I tapped the screen. There they were, Kara and her mother, standing on the porch, Starbucks cups in hand, moving with the confidence of women returning to what they believed was theirs. Kara bent, slid a key into the lock, and turned. Nothing. She frowned, jiggled the handle, tried again. Still nothing. Her mother said something I couldn't hear, but her shoulders stiffened. Kara tried once more, harder this time, until frustration bloomed across her face. Finally, she pulled out her phone. Moments later, mine rang. Mike. "Mom," he said, his voice already laced with irritation. "Someone's changed the locks on that Victorian. Kara and her mom were there this morning, and they can't get in. I think squatters have moved in. We should probably call the police before things get messy." I let the silence stretch. Finally, I asked evenly, "Why does your wife have a key to a house you said you haven't bought?" The line went quiet. So quiet I could hear his breath catch, the little choke of a man caught unprepared. "Mom, it's not what you think," he began, fumbling. "Kara just, well, she wanted to check it out, see if—" I cut him off. "See if what, Mike? That the lock still opened? That I wouldn't notice my own home being toured without me?" He stammered, searching for words, but none came. I ended the call without another sentence. That evening I sat on the porch of the Victorian, the new keys cool in my palm. The roses I had planted swayed in the breeze, and the last light of day filtered through the stained glass, painting me in blue and amber. I thought of Harold, of the life we had built, of the love letter disguised as a life insurance policy. His message was clear. "This is yours. Don't let anyone take it." I wasn't afraid anymore. Still, as I locked the door behind me and climbed the stairs to the turret, Harold's photograph smiling in its usual place, a new unease crept in. Because if Kara had been bold enough to carry keys to a house she never bought, what else had she done behind the veil of help? The answer, I suspected, would chill me far more than a locked door. Lauren arrived at the house one gray morning carrying her laptop bag and 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one with a half smile. "I brought the strong kind," she said. "You'll want it." We sat at the kitchen table, the scent of cinnamon still lingering from the candle I had burned the night before. Lauren opened her laptop, the screen casting her face in cool light. "I did some digging," she began, her voice steady, but edged with something that told me this would not be easy to hear. I wrapped both hands around my coffee, bracing. "Your daughter-in-law," Lauren said, "has a history. This isn't the first time she's maneuvered around an elderly woman's property." My breath stilled. Lauren pulled up county records, scrolling until a scanned deed filled the screen. "Ethel Deacon," she read aloud, "Kara's grandmother. 2 years before she passed, the deed to her home was transferred to Kara. Witness signatures were sparse. One neighbor, a friend of Kara's. No notary until months later. And then," Lauren clicked again, "the house was sold within 12 months. I stared at the document. The old woman's shaky signature stretched across the page like a cry for help. "Neighbors posted online," Lauren continued softly. "They said Ethel was confused in her final months. Sometimes she thought she still lived there, tried to walk back inside after it was sold. People assumed it was dementia. But now—" She trailed off, letting the implication land. I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying the thud of my heart. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't misplaced helpfulness. It was a tactic, targeting older women under the guise of family logistics, smiling, efficient, persuasive, always with a binder, always with a plan. Lauren turned the screen toward me. "I need you to understand this, Evelyn. Kara's pattern is exploitation. What happened with your locks, your house? It's part of something larger. This is who she is. The words felt heavy, like bricks pressing against my ribs. I had spent my life believing that if you loved your children fiercely enough, if you raised them with books and boundaries and Sunday dinners, then the rest would sort itself out. But love cannot inoculate against greed, not theirs, not the greed they marry. I set my coffee down, unable to swallow past the lump in my throat. Lauren leaned forward, her voice gentler now. This isn't about anger, it's about clarity. You need to protect yourself, because people like Kara count on silence, on politeness, on your reluctance to draw lines. I thought of Harold, of how he always said, "Evelyn, you don't vanish by saying no, you vanish by saying yes to everything." I nodded slowly. So we tighten the trust. Yes, Lauren said, and we remove her from any potential authority, power of attorney, executor roles, anything she might attempt to leverage down the road. We make it airtight. Her confidence steadied me, but deep inside, sorrow still pooled. Not fury, not vengeance, just the hollow grief of realizing the enemy wasn't a stranger, but someone I had invited into the family photo album. I walked her out to her car after we finalized the paperwork. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. "Evelyn," Lauren said, pausing at the curb, "I've worked with many widows, many families. You're stronger than most realize. Don't underestimate what silence and paperwork can accomplish." Her words followed me back inside. I went upstairs to the turret room and sat by Harold's picture. The stained glass painted my lap in blues and golds, like a quiet blessing. I whispered, "They think I'm fragile, Harold. They think grief makes me blind. But I see them. I see it all now." And as the colors shifted with the moving sun, I realized the truth. This was never about just one house. It was about every woman who had been cornered in her twilight years, told she was in the way, nudged toward smaller rooms and smaller voices. I wouldn't let that be my story. Still, as evening fell, and I lit another candle in the kitchen, one question echoed in my mind like a riddle. If Kara had already stolen from her own grandmother, what would stop her from trying again, with me? I didn't have to wait long before someone knocked on my door. Not Kara, not Mike, thank heaven. It was Miriam, my neighbor with cranberry scones and lipstick always a shade too bright. She leaned on her cane, balancing a paper sack in her other hand. "Brought you some rhubarb pie," she said. "Don't ask how much sugar is in it. Just eat." I smiled and let her in. We sat at my kitchen table, the pie steaming between us. She sliced it generously, ignoring my protests, and then looked me straight in the eye. "You've got the look," she said. "What look?" I asked. "The look of a woman who's just had the rug pulled out from under her, and she's pretending the floor is enough." I laughed, but it came out brittle. "You see too much." "I've lived too long not to," she replied, her fork already halfway through her slice. "Tell me." So I did. I told her about Kara's tours of the house, the locks, the cameras, Lauren's discovery about her grandmother's deed. I didn't spare details, and Miriam didn't flinch. She only nodded, lips pressed tight, as though every word was one she already knew. When I finished, silence settled between us, heavier than any pie could cut. Finally, Miriam set down her fork. "My daughter," she said quietly, "did something similar when I got pneumonia. I was in the hospital bed, hooked to oxygen, thinking I'd die. She smiled at me every day, stroked my hand, told me not to worry. Meanwhile, she was at the courthouse, consolidating my assets. I blinked. What? She transferred the deed of my house to her name, said it was for efficiency, to keep things simple. I only found out when I came home and saw her signature on the papers. My name was gone. The image hit me hard. Miriam, frail from illness, coming home to find herself erased by her own child's pen. "What did you do?" I asked. She sighed, leaning back, her eyes suddenly old and bright all at once. "I forgave her. She's my daughter. But I never let her back in. Some bridges don't need rebuilding." Her words sank deep. Forgive without granting access. Love without opening the door. I thought of Harold, of his warning not to vanish inside my giving. Perhaps this was what he meant. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were preservation. Miriam squeezed my hand. "You're not alone, Evelyn. Don't let them make you think you are." After she left, I walked through the quiet house, Miriam's words echoing in every creak of the floorboards. Forgive, but do not forget. Love, but with the locks still turned. That evening, as the sun slanted low, the mail arrived. Among the bills and circulars was an envelope addressed in careful, rounded handwriting. To Grandma. My heart tightened. I opened it gently. Inside was a note scrawled in bright crayon. "Grandma, I miss your muffins. Mommy cries a lot. I still love you." Signed, Rachel. Tears blurred the colors. My granddaughter, 8 years old, too young to navigate the storms around her, yet somehow wise enough to send me this lifeline. I pressed the paper to my chest, then walked into the kitchen. I pulled out a recipe card, Harold's old fountain pen, and wrote in neat script, "Grandma's blueberry muffins." At the bottom, I drew a tiny smiley face, awkward but honest. Then I tucked the recipe into an envelope along with a small novelty eraser shaped like a muffin I had once kept in my desk at school. It wasn't much, but it was a message. No matter what storms swirled among the adults, sweetness could still pass between us. As I sealed the envelope, I whispered to myself, "No triangles, no guilt, just love." That night, sitting by the turret window with Harold's picture beside me, I realized something vital. The house, the locks, the paperwork, all of it was armor. But Rachel's letter reminded me why I fought. Not for bricks or deeds, but for dignity, for legacy, for the quiet right to remain whole. Yet as the candle burned low and shadows lengthened across the walls, I knew this wasn't over, because Kara had not yet come herself, and when she did, stripped of gloss and excuses, I would have to decide whether my silence would be enough. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way but one. The sky hung low with pale clouds, the kind that make the world seem hushed. I had just finished watering the roses when I heard the knock, not the sharp, confident rap Kara usually employed, but a hesitant tap, like someone unsure whether they belonged at the door. I dried my hands on my apron and opened it. There she was, Kara. No gloss, no tailored blazer, no binder brimming with tabs. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands falling across a face that looked tired, almost human. For the first time, she seemed younger than her 30-some years, not older, not in control. "Evelyn," she said softly, "may I come in?" I studied her for a moment. The locks behind me were new. The cameras above us blinked faintly, recording. For weeks she had circled like a hawk, entitled and assured. Now she stood like a child asking permission. I opened the door wide enough for her to step inside. The kitchen smelled of lemon polish and fresh bread. She looked around as though it were unfamiliar, though she had once walked these rooms claiming them. I gestured to the table where Harold's photograph rested beside the recipe box. "Sit," I said. She did. For a moment we sat in silence. I poured tea into 2 mugs and pushed one toward her. She wrapped her hands around it but didn't drink. Finally she spoke. "I owe you an apology." Her voice trembled slightly, but I didn't rush to comfort her. I had spent too many years cushioning others at the expense of myself. This time, I let the silence hold. She continued, words tumbling now. I thought I was helping, organizing, planning, preparing for the future. It's what I do. But I see now how it must have looked. Like I was taking. And I'm sorry. I folded my hands around my own mug and looked directly at her. It didn't look like taking, Kara. It was taking. Her eyes flickered up to mine, startled. I leaned forward, steady. You call it help, but help doesn't come with forged documents. Help doesn't arrive with binders and keys to houses it doesn't own. Help doesn't erase grandmothers from deeds or walk another woman's halls assigning rooms. That isn't help, Kara. That's strategy. The words hung heavy, the truth undeniable. She blinked rapidly, her face paling. I didn't mean, she began, but I stopped her with a raised hand. Intent is not the measure here. Behavior is, and your behavior has been deliberate, repeated, harmful. I may be 67, but I am not naive, nor am I invisible. She looked down at her hands, twisting the mug. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Whether they were for me, for herself, or for the unraveling of her carefully spun image, I could not say. I let the silence press again, then spoke slowly. I'm giving you one chance, Kara. Do better, not in words, but in actions. There will be no lawsuits unless you force my hand, but you will have no access to deeds, trusts, or power of attorney. Not now, not ever. Her tears slipped down her cheeks. She whispered, I understand. For a brief moment I saw not the schemer, not the strategist, but a young woman who had perhaps never been told no, never been held accountable. Her apology came haltingly, less performance than surrender. But I did not mistake it for transformation. Real apologies are proven in time, not in the trembling of a single afternoon. We finished our tea in silence. When she rose to leave, she paused at the doorway. Thank you for letting me say this, she murmured. I nodded, nothing more. As the door shut behind her, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt like my own. I touched Harold's photograph, tracing the edge of the frame. She came, I whispered, and I didn't disappear. I stood for a long moment in the kitchen, the scent of bread mingling with the lemon polish, the note of tea still in the air. The lock stood firm, the cameras watched silently, and for the first time in months, I felt not hunted, but whole. Yet even as strength steadied me, a question stirred like wind under the door. Would Kara's words harden into change, or would she circle back, sharper and more desperate than before? A week after Kara's visit, I hosted dinner in the Victorian. Not for Mike, not for Kara, not for anyone who came with conditions or claims. This table was for those who had shown up in small, steady ways when I needed it most. Miriam arrived first, cane tapping against the porch, cranberry scones tucked under her arm. Behind her came Anna and Jamal, the young couple from across the street, who had helped carry lumber during my renovations, and finally Elsie, the paper route girl with hair always escaping her braid, holding a lopsided pie she'd baked herself. The table wasn't glamorous, just roast chicken, vegetables from the farmer's market, and muffins cooling on the counter. But as we sat down, something sacred filled the room. Miriam whispered grace, short and reverent, and we all joined hands. The stained glass above us spilled jeweled colors across the table, blessing each face with amber and blue. As I looked around, I realized, family is not always the people bound to you by blood. Sometimes it is the neighbor who knows your grief, the young couple who lend their hands without being asked, the child who offers pie instead of judgment. Sometimes family is simply those who choose to sit at your table with no expectations but kindness. After dinner, when the dishes were washed and laughter still hummed in the corners of the house, I opened my laptop to an email from Lauren. The subject line read, "Finalized estate documents." I clicked, and there it was. Kara removed from every legal authority, every potential claim, power of attorney revoked, executor roles reassigned, my will updated. Should Mike and Kara ever truly change, sustained counseling, consistent respect, no financial games, they might inherit a portion. If not, the assets would pass into a charitable trust, with a fund for Rachel when she turned 25. It wasn't revenge. It was stewardship. I leaned back, relief loosening the knots in my shoulders. The click of a pen, the stroke of a signature. Quiet tools, but powerful. Later, while sorting old paperwork in the turret, I found an envelope tucked into the back of Harold's file box. The handwriting was his. My heart stuttered as I opened it. "Evelyn," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't have time to say everything. You were never supposed to vanish inside your giving. You don't need a place at the table, you built the table. Promise me you'll live loudly enough to fill the silence when I'm gone." Tears slipped down my cheeks, not of sorrow this time, but of release. His words were the permission I hadn't known I was waiting for. I placed the letter in a frame and set it on the hall table, where anyone who entered would see it. My quiet manifesto. That weekend, Mike called. His voice was softer than I'd heard in years. He said he and Kara had started counseling at a modest center near the bookstore I loved. "If we really change, Mom," he asked, "would you come back?" I let the silence stretch, not cruelly, but truthfully. Some answers need time to grow. I didn't fill the space with mother-saving words. I simply said, "We'll see." Because boundaries, once drawn, are not erased with apologies. They are proven with consistency. The next morning I sat on the porch with a mug of Earl Grey. The roses leaned toward the sun. Harold's letter rested framed inside, and Rachel's crayon drawing, Grandma's Castle, was pinned above the arched doorway. Through the stained glass, the light painted the walls in blues and ambers. The house exhaled with me, not as a possession to guard, but as a piece I had claimed. The locks weren't to keep others out. They were to keep me in, present, awake, unerased. And for the first time in years, I understood what it meant to be fully alive at 67, not waiting for permission, not shrinking to fit someone else's story, but choosing my own. A porch, a cup of tea, a neighbor with scones, a letter from the man who still loved me past the veil of death. It wasn't a courtroom victory or a grand confrontation. It was something quieter and far more powerful. It was me.